Hello, and welcome to the Natural State Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Anthony Gustin. It is my belief that the natural state of any living organism is health, and that our artificial habitat has forced us into having artificial health problems. This show is my attempt to dive deep and learn about using nutrition, sleep, movement, relationships, and more to help you reclaim your natural state of health in a modern world and show you how to thrive in an environment that's stacked against you. If you enjoyed today's show, you can find out more details and information at dranthonygustin.com. We're coming at you today with another Q&A episode. Me and my good friend Chris Irvin as co-host, diving in deep to some big news on my end, which is that my fiance Martha and I just got a farm outside of Austin. So a lot of stuff going on there, and detailed in this podcast is why we chose to do this and my plans for the farm. So a lot around testing nutrient density of foods and learning how to create scalable ways for regenerative agriculture to take off. Some more questions we have are just nutrient density of some other foods, my take on lab-grown meat, and some others. So tune into this one, and I hope you guys take a lot out. And if anybody else has any farming resources, who has transitioned from not being a farmer at all to doing sort of any homesteading, any transitioning to regenerative agriculture, please send those resources my way. That'd be much appreciated. Otherwise, tune into this one, and I hope you guys enjoy. Before we get to the episode, I wanted to chat about our sponsor, Perfect Keto. Perfect Keto is all about making a ketogenic diet healthy and accessible. Whether you're reading all of our online guides or articles or enjoying Perfect Keto's exogenous ketones or any other keto-friendly products, everything you need to make keto work for you is at perfectketo.com. I know what you're thinking. Hey, aren't you the founder of Perfect Keto? Yep, that's right. And all of my insanely high standards have been put into making each and every product. My background as a functional medicine clinician helps me craft the cleanest and healthiest possible products and the best information about a ketogenic diet. Head on over to perfectketo.com to learn anything you need to know about the ketogenic diet. And if you've never tried any of our products before, feel free to use the code KETOPODCAST for 20% off your first order. With that being said, let's get into the show.
Here we are again, Chris.
Another Q&A episode. It's been a while, man.
Yeah, I know. And I'm sad that you're not sitting next to me on a table.
I know. I was actually wondering going into this how we were going to do this. We haven't had to do a social distanced Q&A episode yet.
If the chemistry is off, people, you know why. Chris is in Illinois. I'm in Texas.
Although our weather does seem to be about the same right now, which is pretty rare for this time of year.
It is sad. It is sad. Yeah, got a lot of good questions. A lot has changed since the last time we did this, I think a couple months ago. So let's fire into it.
Yeah. So I think the first question is going to come with some, explaining of some things that have changed for you, some big news that you have. But first question is what are the plans for the new farm? And I'm excited to hear this answer as well.
Yeah. So big news is that Martha and I got a farm here east of Austin. As we started digging into it, I realized what an idiot I am for putting so much on my plate. That's historically what I've liked to do is just jam my plate so full of responsibilities that I get really overwhelmed. But yeah, it's how I get things done. It's how I thrive. But the sort of impetus of this is just, we've been thinking about getting land for a while, just because it just, whenever I read stuff, whenever I think about what matters to me, I always want to be in nature more and not be in a city, even though Austin isn't that big of a city. Martha was in New York. I was in San Francisco before we moved here. And even still, I think that we keep wanting to get outside and be in nature far more. Mm-hmm. We want to stop traveling every time we need that. And so that was a big impetus for it. But also, if people can't tell from my newsletters and from the podcast, I've been getting quite into regenerative agriculture over the last 6+ months, especially. But I think that it's one of these things where you're a truth seeker in health. People seem to be independently coming to the same conclusions over time. There's a whole paleo movement, and then from there, things drove into keto. And now I think that sort of the whole, if you just keep asking questions on how do we fix the food system, how do we get people healthy, it just ultimately comes down how food is grown and distributed. And I think that all the problems there are solved in regenerative agriculture. The main reason why I'm so excited about this is just, I think that I generally solve problems, create businesses, and create value for the world when I am part of the crowd that I'm trying to solve problems for very intimately. And so what I mean by that is I was in Cairo school, and even before that, I wanted to be really into sports medicine, and I had a lot of sports injuries myself. So I wanted to fix that. I was into being athletic and being more pain-free. So that was a huge point of that. And I switched to functional medicine work as I was looking into a lot of that stuff in myself and how to optimize myself using more in-depth lab markers. And I was doing keto a lot. Yes, my patients were doing it, but I was doing CrossFit. I was doing paleo type of stuff. I made products for that. It's just everything that I've done sort of externally to try to sort of make the world a better place has come from me being obsessed with a certain lifestyle and diving in. After that, I sort of know and learn all the problems and try to fix things then at scale. And the same thing was with farming. Like I want to learn how to grow my own food and how to do it in a way that's non-destructive, that's as nutrient dense as possible, which I think no one is thinking about. So that's sort of like the main thing is like, how can I learn and be part of this community as much as I can so I can understand the problems, not only from consumer end, which I'm already there, but more from a food production and distribution end. There's so many problems here and questions that I have that no one seems to be able to answer around, is this stuff scalable? What are the main problems with getting people switched over to this type of model? I mean, I'm already now learning how complex it is. There's essentially no education to help people like myself who are interested in this switch from, I mean, our land is not that big. It's 20 acres. And sort of how we arrived at that size is that there's this guy that I've been reading a lot. His name's Richard Perkins, who has a book called Regenerative Agriculture. It's a giant textbook. It's phenomenal. His is 18 acres and it's an extremely productive farm and very profitable. I think they make like $1 million a year in profit. And this guy pretty much does it all. It's in Sweden. So it's like, okay, if this guy is like the regenerative agriculture savant with this much acreage, like I don't need any more than that. And I think that I would just get overwhelmed otherwise. But just trying to figure out, I mean, he's in Sweden and Texas. The differences between that I thought were going to be like very easy to figure out. They're not. Even within Austin area, I mean, this is a very specific example because Austin has, I think, 8 different subclimates that are all sort of clashing together. But you can drive 20 minutes and have a completely different landscape and a completely different need for, soil types, water amount, precipitation amount, plants that grow there natively. It's insane. So I think that one of the biggest problems with regenerative agriculture, as I dive into this, is just education up front. Mm-hmm. I'm trying to cobble together all this stuff. So like, I don't know what it looks like eventually if I'll create some sort of education platform once I learn a little bit more. But yeah, I mean, it's baffling how little information there actually is. So I'm sort of getting in the middle of a ramble here, but plans are to learn as much as possible about why we have problems in this space, and why there aren't more scalable solutions being done right now to help people switch to more regenerative model. Mm-hmm. How that looks practically. And I also I want a space for myself where I can be in nature, work with my hands, stop being by a computer. I hate this type of work of just sitting down and staring at a computer screen all day, even though it's what I do primarily. I'm trying to get away from that a little bit more. Mm-hmm. Growing my own food is a huge plus as well. I mean, that's sort of like a dream of mine to have sort of a homestead and grow everything that I eat. Eventually, maybe grow some cotton and make my own clothes, be completely self-sustainable. Who knows? But yeah. And then sort of how that's going to work is I was filling you in on this a little bit, but the thing that I don't think any farmers do, because every farmer has to worry about profit, and it's a very low margin business being in farming. Mm-hmm. And so even if you do things the right way, I mean, farming is a business and you need to do things to have income or else you got a business. It's just the way it is. And so a lot of animal production looks at yields, not at nutrient quality and nutrient density. So there's no incentive right now for farmers to care about nutrient density, which I find kind of bizarre. Like our food system, that should be the point that's most important. How can we grow as much nutrient dense food for as many people as possible? Right. Yeah, we sort of go the opposite way. Like, how can we just get calories in people's guts?
I was going to say the incentive is to produce calories, not nutrients.
Yeah. Produce calories. And then also it's morphed into like, okay, produce calories and then ship those to a food manufacturer who then manipulates them to make them as addictive as possible. Like that's the incentive. Mm-hmm. Just so people buy more of the thing. It's insane. So where I find this manifested most is in chicken products. So people have been told over the last 40, 50 years, stop eating red meat. If saturated fat's bad, like red meat's going to kill you for all these different reasons. Saturated fat, it's going to cause cancer, blah, 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 blah. We obviously know that's not true. If you want more resources on that, listen to any, probably 80% of the podcasts that I've done over the last year.
Right.
Sacred Cow is a good resource for this as far as a book. But yeah, I mean, no need to get into why red meat isn't bad, but people have listened. People have listened to the general advice that you shouldn't eat red meat. If you look at a chart, consumption of poultry is up a significant amount and consumption of red meat is down over the last couple of decades. So people are eating way more chicken. The problem with that is that chicken and ruminant animals, beef, lamb, goats, even animals that can ferment things in their guts, their physiology is very different and we do not feed them the same thing. So a lot of people don't understand that with cows, you can feed them grain, you can feed them grass, you can feed them whatever the hell you want. But what will happen is they, in their gut, will ferment whatever you give them into short chain fatty acids, which then go into their bloodstream and get incorporated into their fatty acids. So that's good. That's the superpower that they have to be able to turn whatever they eat into basically a form of fat that we can digest and have no problem with. However, with chickens and pigs and any other animals that are monogastric, meaning one stomach, same as us, if we eat something like vegetable oils or a lot of seeds and nuts, things that have high amount of polyunsaturated fatty acids, specifically linoleic acid, that is not what our body's meant to be made of, but we can't transform that in our gut before we absorb it. So what we eat becomes part of our actual fat in our tissues and our cell membranes and all that stuff. So that is not good because that will lead to inflammatory cascades. So these fats that we get put into our cell membranes and stored as fatty acids are very reactive. So once they get reactive, they'll basically start this inflammation process in your body that just doesn't stop. It's like sort of like a firecracker chain of effect here. Also, so when you start burning fat, you'll release some in your bloodstream, which is not good. All your cell membranes generally should be very, so like think about it as blown up like a beach ball. These get crumpled up, sort of like a crumpled up page of a newspaper when you have polyunsaturated fatty acids making up your cell membrane. The problem with that is that you have all these transporters on a cell membrane that send messages out, receive messages in, tell the cell what to do, tell the cell to destruct, et cetera. So when you manipulate the cell membrane, then you're basically screwing your entire body and how your body communicates internally. So, I mean, we could go on and on about why polyunsaturated fatty acids and linoleic acid especially are terrible for humans. A big point here, though, is that chickens used to have a content in their fat of around 2 to 3% polyunsaturated fatty acids. This is sort of like what we should be eating in general. So you need some PUFA for some slipperiness in your cell membranes, things like that. So you don't want to go to 0, but you don't want to go over, single digits for sure. But our historical precedent said it at about 2 to 3%. This is about what cows have when you butcher a cow, no matter what you feed them, because they have this, the fermented gut. So you have cows that 2 to 3% polyunsaturated fatty acids. Chickens and pork should be historically accurate. If you look at hunter-gatherer populations in some islands where they have more heritage breeds of chicken and pork, their fatty acids are at about 2 to 3%. What happened is over the last 100, 200 years, we took breeds of chickens that could grow really, really fast. And we took a bunch of feed and we fed those chickens the feed that they grew really fast on, and then kept selecting the chickens that grew fast on the feed, kept refining the feed, kept feeding it to the chickens that grew fast. So basically weeded out the genes of the chickens that grew slow and ate bugs and grew naturally, and selected for the chickens that basically grow faster than what we've seen in all human history. Those chickens basically need to be fed supplemental feed. And where does that supplemental feed come from? Well, it comes obviously from usually GMO corn and soy. Mm-hmm. Even if it's non-GMO or organic, that doesn't really matter. So you're still getting chickens who eat corn and soy, wheat, whatever kind of bullshit, cheap feed. Because again, we're talking about the business is to make money as a farmer. And so if you're feeding chickens, like that's an input cost, right? If I sell a chicken, I want to have that chicken be as low cost for me as possible. If I'm going after sort of like the healthy market, people are trying to get free range pastured birds. Well, I still need to get them to slaughter faster, meaning I want them to grow as fast as they can. So I can, instead of it takes 6 months to get a chicken in someone's hands from when it's birthed, I want it to be at 2 months or 3 months. And so a lot of these chickens are bred to be basically to slaughter at 60 to 90 days and on feed that's as low cost as possible, even if it's organic or GMO free. This means that they're incorporating all these seeds, all this corn, all this soy, whatever they're given that they're not usually having access to in a natural diet. And they incorporate into their fatty tissues and their cell membranes, just like humans do. Mm-hmm. So when you sample a chicken, even if it's like a pastured bird now, vast majority of them, no one looks at this because again, no one's incentivized to, but as far as what I've seen, even if it's a commercially raised chicken to a pastured chicken, you're going to get levels like 20%, 25% of polyunsaturated fatty acids. So that looks actually not too dissimilar from some okay vegetable oils. Mm-hmm. And so you're getting chickens that look completely different from a heritage breed, but we're eating them thinking they're health food. I think we've talked about this before, but I just generally don't think chicken is a health food. It doesn't have that many nutrients and this problem with polyunsaturated fatty acids. I just thought that's how chickens were. I didn't realize that we had manipulated the genes of the chickens by selecting them as well as giving them feed. Whereas like if I were to be a chicken farmer right now, I would essentially have to feed them the feed because it grows so fast.
Right.
So I had this sort of like plan to use the farm for experiments to figure out a better way to commercialize chicken production, focusing on first nutrient quality. I think that there is a market for this. I've like very briefly talked about this online via like Twitter a couple of times and maybe on a couple other podcasts. But in general, like every time I talk about it, I get tons of messages, people asking where they can buy low PUFA chicken or pork. I think people are getting wise to the idea that like polyunsaturated fatty acids are not good. I think this is another big next health wave we're going to is looking at polyunsaturated fatty acids, linoleic acid particularly, and showing how terrible it is for people, vegetable oil, et cetera. Like, I think that's a giant next thing that we dig into, and it'll be looking back and be like, wow, I can't believe we were eating all this vegetable shortening. It's essentially the same thing when in liquid form. Right. Can't believe we were eating trans fats and now that all stuff's banned. Like we will look back in 20 years from now, I hope, and have the same lens on that type of stuff. So using the farm to look at sort of these different areas of chicken production primarily first, and then we'll move to pork. Testing out, okay, can we get different breeds of chickens? Can we get, what's tricky about that is that heritage breeds tend to fly away, so you can't control them as much. And then when they fly away, then they get eaten by coyotes and stuff. So I'm going to test different breeds. I'm going to test different feed. So even if you take a breed that is, for example, one that grows to 60, 90 days to slaughter. Okay. What if you take a really low omega-6 feed blend? And I'm sure there's ways to make that. Like, how can you make a cheap, low omega-6 feed blend that you could sell to farmers who are already doing this? That's like low cost for them to switch. Mm-hmm. And then test after these birds are dead. I'm going to send them all to labs and basically look at their fatty acid profiles and their nutrient density scores and see, okay, what happens here when we use different breeds? What happens here when we use different feed? And sort of see the example and then try to extrapolate how can this be applied to farming at scale? Like, how are other people doing it? And so that way we can hopefully make some sort of system or business around getting much higher quality and more nutrient dense food to public. So very long-winded answer about what the plans are for the farm. So I'm sure you have some questions.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think you actually led into the next question, I think unknowingly, about just PUFA content in chicken and pork. But I think to kind of just go back a little bit to why you're doing what you're doing. I think for anybody who's confused about how, you're somebody who's in the health and wellness space, why you're getting into regenerative agriculture, I think it's just like this growing understanding that, you've definitely had and you've shared with me over the last couple of years of that, like the food that we eat doesn't just impact ourselves and our own health. It also has an impact on the environment. It has an impact on, our economy. It has an impact on other people. It's just this widespread thing. So, I think we're starting to both look at food a little bit more holistically and not just about like, low carb keto. We're starting to look at the sourcing. We're starting to look at the quality of the foods. I think, nutrient density has always been something that's been important to us, but I think now it's more focusing on, what practices are we supporting with the foods that we're eating? When you always talk about voting with your dollars, when you go to a market, when you go to, whether it's a store or a farmer's market, you're supporting something with the foods that you're buying. And I think it's just trying to get an understanding of what you are supporting. And I think it's really cool that, what you're doing with this farm, you're going to be doing something that other people haven't done. We do know that there's some farmers out there that are doing really great things when it comes to animal agriculture, but a lot of that stuff's not being quantified. And I think that's one of the unique things that you're doing with sending these chickens in to be tested, is you're actually going to be able to quantify the practices that you're doing to show that they're better. I mean, some of the questions that we're going to have coming up about beef, about grass-fed versus, conventional raised beef, a lot of that stuff, we don't have a lot of things to quantify the difference between them. We have mechanisms that explain why they might be different. And there's, a lot of environmental components to that conversation, but we don't have any of the quantitative measures to say that this is or isn't better. So I think it's really cool that you're doing it. Before we get into some of those other questions, I'm curious though, what does the farm look like now? And what, you're talking about having chicken. It sounds like chicken and pork might be the two first things that you're going to be introducing to the farm. But is there going to be, are you going to be going towards beef, I assume, and including other animals into it? And also, outside of animals, what about any plant agriculture that you're going to be doing on the farm?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I think that with the regenerative stuff in general, there's a lot of good stuff happening where when you combine more species, the whole thing, the whole system just works far better. So a lot of people are doing this, like for instance, at White Oak, Will Harris, 18 species or something crazy like that. Joel Salatin has a bunch as well. Like these are some like the granddaddies in this space. So like I want to get to a lot of species eventually, but I want to sort of start at a system where I can do these experiments without, I have a couple of other businesses. I'm a pretty busy guy, so I don't have a lot of time. So once I start getting this going, figuring out some way to have the farm be self-sustaining, I don't want to sink tons of money into it just for education of people that may not even care. So like once it's self-sustaining, I'm just going to keep reinvesting everything I can into the farm. I'm actually going to start with bees. Bees are going to be the first thing.
Oh, cool.
So we seeded a bunch of fields with wildflowers and native grasses. And we're getting 11 hives of bees in the spring. That's when you get new bees. But that's sort of like the starting point of a lot of anything that grows. Bees are fascinating. I took a course on it. It's just a wild thing. They're like very low amount of upkeep. So it's something like a couple hours once a quarter, basically. And great thing about that is that you get tax advantages for agricultural exemption if you have a certain amount of bees per acreage. So that's sort of like the rule for our county. And so
kind of the one thing that people agree on with like the food security and everything is that like the threat to bees right now is pretty intense and something that should be focused on. I feel like that's kind of like a universally well understood thing.
Yeah. So basically the bees will be free to set up and manage essentially due to the tax breaks. And then we'll be able to have a little bit of a profit center there from having free honey to sell. Like we'll have honey that's essentially priced at zero cost for us. And we just get to have a really good seeding of the environment and have bees really take care of the area. Next up will be chickens, just because they're so easy to set up and maintain. And you don't have to do much. Like they don't really get sick. They just, if anything happens to them, they just die. So they're fairly easy and simple to work with.
I do have a quick question on the bees though, before you go past that. Is there any threats to bee health in like Austin? Like I know just like reading a lot of the work of like Paul Stamets, he talks a lot about the different viruses and things that are taking out, like the deformed wing virus and I think it's the Lake Sinai virus that are like taking out the bees. And I know he has some like treatments that are meant to like kind of increase the immunity of these bees to those viruses. Is that a threat in Austin, or is that other areas of the United States primarily?
Not that I know of. I think because, you've been here before, like in the springtime and the summer, how many different species of plants grow here. And there's just bees really thrive in this area. This area is also the highest, like one of the most dense places for allergies for humans, because there's so many different plants, so many different pollinators. So good for bees, bad for humans. Yeah. But as far as I know, they're not at complete danger here as they are.
I didn't know if you had to do any special treatments to them to ensure their safety on the farm.
No. So starting with bees, getting some chickens probably very, very soon. And then we'll be adding goats to some areas that are overgrown. Like the land's pretty rough shape too. So So trying to figure out, I mean, there's another piece of like, okay, if we want cows in a certain area, like what is the best path forward? Like we have weeds that are like 5 feet tall right now. So you trim that down, try to plant cover crop, and then try to plant grasses so that the cows next year could have pasture for it. But if enough doesn't outcompete the weeds, well, then the cows are going to starve. You have to supplement them with hay. It's like, there's all this complex stuff that I'm trying to figure out. Right. Management of ruminants is a little more complex than chickens. Martha's going to be on greenhouse and plant duty. So I want to start growing mushrooms out there ASAP as well.
What kind of mushrooms?
A whole variety. So this is, every time I go to the farmer's market, I cringe at having to pay like $30 for a 3-ounce package of like lion's mane or what, I mean, the mixes at Mueller's farmer's market that we usually.
A lot of the ones there aren't naturally grown either. A lot of those are lab grown at Mueller and some of those farmers markets.
Yeah. So I think that it's not necessarily, I would say, natural versus lab grown. They're not like, I mean, you start with a substrate and then they grow the substrate. And so we'd probably just grow those in the garage or build another building for them. Yeah. Trying to grow them like on the ground is I don't think any real mushrooms are grown like that anymore, that at scale, at least. Going to be growing a bunch of herbs, just a variety of plants. Also going to be testing their long-term, more like heritage seeds of plants. So another big thing about just carnivore diet in general and why people, I think, are succeeding with that is even if people are eating a whole foods based diet. I mean, we're talking about, okay, chickens have changed a little bit from 2%, 3% polyunsaturated fatty acids to 20. Cows, basically not at all. Cows are pretty much historically accurate to animals we would have eaten hundreds of thousands of years ago. Plants, however, we have manipulated in an enormous degree. So the plants that we eat are completely different than what we used to eat. And we're only eating a couple of them compared to, like, I think it was a couple hundred species that humans used to eat of any given plant. So like, yes, there's all this talk about plant toxins, things like that. Well, we used to spread that toxin load against 200 species instead of 5, 8, 10, maybe. You go into Whole Foods, even you go into anybody who's sort of eating any food, they're getting mass produced like 4, 5, 6, 8 vegetables that they only eat. Like everybody eats a kale salad every single day. Well, that kale is being mass produced and has been changed a lot from its like wild counterpart that we used to eat. And so you just get this repeated exposure to toxins over time. So I'm a little bit more about seasonality and using heritage breeds. And so Boggy Creek is a farm that I go to. And basically all my produce I eat is from there. And whatever's not seasonal here, I just don't eat. I'll just eat meat instead. So trying to think about, okay, what are these people not getting also around what used to grow here? What can we grow in abundance in different seasons? How can we spread out this load? How can we make stuff that basically people would not recognize if they went to a grocery store? I think that's probably where people should get back to when they're eating plants. Again, to repeat, like I am not a carnivore advocate as far as thinking that people shouldn't be eating plants. We've eaten plants for our entire human history, and there's plenty of examples of people who live long and healthy lives eating plants. If they're a part of a complex system like a human, taking them out is probably going to lead to some problems as well. But again, like we're at a point where like the plant consumption we have is not historically accurate. So trying to get back to that and mimicking that, that's very complex as well, but easy to do. You're not dealing with lives of animals here. So it's, sort of low risk. Then we'll start with the chickens and we'll keep adding on from there. So yeah, I don't know what the hell I'm doing. These plans may change wildly in the next couple of weeks, given more information I get, but it's sort of like the plan I have as of late October, 2020.
Yeah. How is the health of the soil that you have? Is that something that you were able to test like prior to purchasing it? Like, do you know where that stands and what you need? Like, obviously you're following this regenerative model where, you're going to be trying to improve that over time, but is it pretty low quality soil where it currently stands, or is it in a decent shape right now?
Yeah, it's not low quality per se. It's just that area in general, all East Texas, basically from like I-35 all the way east was like the agricultural hotbed for this area for a very, very long period of time, hundreds of years.
Where we drove all the buffaloes out and everything like that.
Yeah, there's a big, like the Colorado comes through there and then has all these tributaries. Like for instance, our property has a big creek through it, and Boggy Creek Farm is what I just talked about. Like Boggy Creek ran through all of East Austin even, and then it goes into the like right where like the downtown in Austin that goes into the Colorado River. And so basically from there all the way east, a couple 100 miles, the nutrient density of the soil is actually pretty good. There's not a lot of organic matter where we're at because there hasn't been a lot of animals on it. And so I also thought about, okay, do I get organic chicken manure and spread it on the soil to try to kickstart the organic matter? But in some parts, it's like eroded and pretty brutal. Some parts it's okay. I mean, I have like 3 different soil types on 20 acres, which is insane. So I have clay in some parts, have loam soil, which is really good for vegetables and stuff like that. I have sandy soil. And so I don't know. I'm not a soil expert yet, but trying to figure all that stuff out.
Yeah. Just curious about, just reading about just kind of history and things, how that area used to be so fertile with, due to there was a lot of animals in the area. And then as we, back in the 1800s, mid 1800s, when we were, moving out west, how we kind of drove a lot of the animals out and we started doing a lot more plant agriculture, and that really depleted the soil there. So I was just kind of curious what you were dealing with there. And is it, was that farm previously used for a different type of farming, or did they have animals there before, or what was going on there before you bought it?
So the previous owners were trying to do some of this stuff, rotational grazing, especially. They were more growing trees. So they were a nursery primarily. That's where they made all their money. But yeah, they were trying to get some stuff kickstarted, and they had some issues with it. They moved down South Texas. So, and then it's been basically vacant for a year plus.
Got it.
In kind of rough shape. But a lot of the area out there is less from like large crops that you would see in Illinois or Minnesota or Midwest, in areas where the soil is more fertile. It was more growing hay at large amounts, spraying crops, overgrazing with cattle, things like that was more the problem here.
Yeah.
But certainly larger crops as well. But yeah, more of like an overgrazing and basically disturbing and pulling off all the animals so that the land erodes really quickly. Like it shouldn't be as sandy as it is in a lot of spots on my land, but trying to figure out how I can help change that. I mean, part of that first step is getting native grasses, wildflowers back on there, because their root systems are so much deeper that right now when you can see it in part of the property, like when it rains, everything washes off through like this big channel through like half the property. There's a lot of exposed soil there. So I'm letting all the leaves stay. We already planted or seeded all these wildflowers. And so what happens hopefully is that these things will germinate, create root systems that are deep down. Then when it rains the next few seasons, less erosion will happen and more stuff will grow around there, and it'll be able to hold way more water. So yeah, I mean, I've learned so much in the last couple of months. It is crazy.
Yeah.
And I'm sure I'm not even 1% of the way of where I'm going to be over the next year.
Well, I think it's cool that you're kind of going on that journey though, of like learning it as you go, right? Like you can sit and read all the books you want, or you can go out and try applying it. And I think it's pretty cool that you're doing that.
Yeah. I'm very much learn by experience kind of guy.
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, it's hard work and it's expensive, but you know what? You only live once, right?
Yeah. Dr. Gustin's going to have to get his fingernails a little dirty for this project, it sounds like.
Oh yeah, they're always dirty.
So the next question that we had, you kind of touched on it a little bit. We were talking about just like lower PUFA chicken and pork. But the question is do you know any brands that currently have lower PUFA chicken and pork? Do you know it, or do you want to add anything to that conversation? Yeah.
So this guy, his name is Brad something, I forget. He is doing this thing called a croissant diet. And so I don't know if you've heard about this.
I haven't.
But yeah, it's great. Look it up. I mean, basically his hypothesis is that eating he's he's an engineer who turned pig farmer, who is now researching a bunch of nutrition stuff. He's fascinating. I mean, I love anybody who has a different background going into nutrition, because they're usually looking at things from a different lens. And he's basically in this war against linoleic acid, but using a lot of these just theories around fatty acid metabolism and using stearic acid, which is a saturated fat that very specifically blunts a lot of pathways in your body that cause inflammation and fat oxidation. So his stuff is really fascinating, but in general, like he's one of the only people who is looking at this, and he's doing pork. He hasn't produced anything yet. I'm on his list for like the first batch, and then I'm going to send it out to an additional third-party lab to see. and compare it to sort of like whatever I get at Salt and Thyme or something.
Yeah.
So I think it's called Fire Starter or Fire in a Bottle or something like that. So we'll put his information in the show notes. Not shipping yet, but he's one person that I've seen. Somebody sent me, I put this on Twitter, my email last week, and somebody sent me a place called Slinker's Meats. Do you know this place?
I haven't heard of this one. No.
They're in Central Texas, and I've never heard of them either. But as with most farmers, their branding is needing some help. And I haven't looked at their stuff much. I haven't ordered from them, but they claim to have low omega-6, high omega-3 chicken and pork.
Yeah, I was going to say they're saying that they're offering grass-fed meat, which is beef, buffalo, lamb, and goat, and then omega-3 poultry and omega-3 pork, as well as grass-fed pet food. Interesting. Yeah.
So, I mean, this is the thing, like we have gone really kind of off the deep end, and people are so fascinated with omega-3. I think it's less omega-3 than we need to worry about. I think it's just lower omega-6.
Right.
And I think that will change sort of how people perceive this.
Well, I mean, if you think about it, the reason why we've needed an increase in omega-3 is because we've ate more omega-6s. So if we can lower that omega-6 intake, we likely don't need to focus as much on omega-3.
Yeah, I mean, it's duofold. Like we're also eating way less omega-3 as well.
Yeah. Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I don't know of many other sources. If anybody who's listening to this knows of other sources, please send them my way because I will share them widely and I'll probably try them myself. But yeah, I mean, I don't really eat pork or chicken for this reason currently. But I'm excited to try it out.
Very cool. So stay with the chicken and the egg conversation here. Next question is nutritionally, is there a difference between commercial egg and farm fresh egg?
Yes. Look at them. I mean, you can just look at them and see for sure. But I mean, it's the same thing. So whatever the animal is going to eat is going to go into the food that it produces or whatever it is. So if it's eating shitty stuff from GMO corn and soy and not having access to anything that's actually broad use in nutrients, then yes, it's going to change. I'm going to also try to test eggs for this whole thing as well. So will eggs also reduce in polyunsaturated fatty acid content? So egg yolks right now, I don't remember the percentage, but are fairly high in polyunsaturated fatty acids. Mm-hmm. I don't really mind because I eat so much other fat that as a percentage of my diet, it's pretty low. If I have 4 eggs, 5 eggs a day, it's not going to matter, but I want to lower it and make it species appropriate if possible.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, you can see the difference. And a lot of time, I mean, that's the vitamin A in the egg yolks, fat soluble nutrients. I mean, of course, like omega concentration here. I mean, you can feed high omega-3 feeds to chicken and the yolks will have higher density of omega-3. So 100%. The nutrients are more dense in a farm fresh egg, which is like, again, a loaded term because what does that really mean?
Right.
What is the farm feeding them? If it's a fully pastured chicken and it's fresh from the farm, but they feed them GMO corn and soy, then I wouldn't eat that egg either.
Right. Yeah. And that's something that we kind of see a lot of too. We actually talk about that a lot in the Keto Answers book when we have our chapter on like food sourcing, where it's like, we use a lot of these terms like farm fresh or pasture raised and all these things, but that doesn't really tell you what they're being fed. It doesn't really necessarily tell you how they're treated. It's just telling you that they're not, stuck inside of a barn getting 5 minutes of yard time every single day. But that doesn't necessarily, give away to what they're eating. I think, and that's probably one of the reasons why we're really big advocates for supporting local farms and going to your farmers markets, is because you actually have the ability to ask those questions, right? Like you can go to somebody at the Mueller market in Austin and say, hey, you guys have farm fresh eggs, but what are you actually feeding your chickens? How are they actually living? I think that's a huge thing to add there. Do you think that when it comes to somebody who's thinking about their health and nutrition, maybe they're trying to look at budget when it comes to getting their quality food, is the juice worth the squeeze to get a farm fresh egg that is fed, a better diet compared to those commercial eggs?
I think so, but you have to ask, where else are you getting nutrition? I think that there's better bang for your buck if you're strapped for cash and going on a budget. Buy liver, for example.
Right.
That's going to be way cheaper than eggs. Mm-hmm. If you're talking about the $8, $9, $10 a dozen that you usually get from the farmer's market.
Yeah. Yeah, I think too, when talking about the cost of that too, if you can get farm fresh eggs if you can find a local farmer, those farm fresh eggs are likely going to be a little bit cheaper than what you're going to be getting at the store when you're going to buy like the, pasture raised eggs or whatever at your local supermarket. You're usually able to get those for a little bit better cost when you're going to the farmer's market. That was one thing I found out in Austin. Just switching to getting most of my food from the farmer's market out there was that when you're getting it there versus the store, there's a lot less markup on this stuff, and you actually are able to get it for a price that's a little bit more comparable to some of the commercially produced foods.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of insane how little farmers actually get for producing our food when you buy it at a grocery store. This is why I don't buy anything from the grocery store anymore.
Yeah,
I buy directly from farms, maybe a butcher shop that is close to me, otherwise directly from the farm. Like, if you want to vote for your dollar, buy directly from the farmer. It's like pennies of the dollar that they're actually producing of the finished good cost when you buy from a store. When you buy directly from them, all of the money goes to them.
Right.
Maybe some small percentage to a farmer's market or a butcher shop or whatever. But if you want to support this stuff, give your money to the people who are growing your food.
Yeah. I mean, it's the best way that you can, if you care about this, if you're listening to this conversation, it's the best way you can support it. I mean, that was another thing being out in Austin that really got to take advantage of is like go to the farmer's market and you find somebody, my guy, Bill, out there, I forget the name of his farm.
Shirtail Creek?
No, not Shirtail Creek, but they're another great one.
Chickamauga.
Yeah. So Bill out Chickamauga, just like guys like him who, you go and you buy your meat from them, and you not only are you're getting a better source, but you're supporting him and you're allowing him to, further invest into his farm and further invest into good practices. So it's like, that's like one of the best impacts that you can make, right? Rather than going and giving your dollars to Whole Foods or whatever supermarkets local to you, you can go give it to that farmer and, support him, his family, and support the practices he's doing that are, better for everybody.
Right. I mean, this is stuff that like people don't think through intelligently. A lot of people right now, when they post on social media, react to things, generally don't think and use their brain. And a lot of times it's like people bitch about Bezos being a billionaire. Oh, taking all your money. Like, you should pay everybody else that. You should give me your money. Or you could just stop spending money at Whole Foods. You should stop buying an iPhone. Like, you just live locally. Give your money to the people around you if you really care. Stop using Twitter to put these ideas out and go talk to your neighbors. How about that? But yeah, I mean, I'm just like, it's one of these things of if there's a choice and if you can afford it, get your stuff locally.
Right.
I mean, the way I've been around communities where people literally give food away because people produce stuff on a local scale. It's like, oh, I'm the person who makes tomatoes and I have 300 extra pounds. Here, let me give you these. And they go, oh, I have way extra chicken eggs because I have so many chickens right now. And they just give each other food because there's such a surplus.
Yeah.
We don't have like the price of food, real food from local farmers is so high because nobody's supporting it directly.
Right.
If you want it lower, just keep supporting them and get everybody else to buy it.
Yeah.
I'm actually working on, I don't know if I've told you this or not. I'm working on a listing website that basically all the things that I'm learning about how to assess a farm, how to look at it. I'm going to create guides and resources on how to do this, but then also a very easy to filter website. We just type in like, oh, I want beef. That's this, doesn't have this type of feed, low proof of chicken, whatever. And it will filter out where the closest one to you is. Hopefully, eventually it will have like an online sort of like API to their website where you can just buy directly online, but that should be out by the end of the year. If I can find time in my schedule to devote to it.
Sounds like another project you're taking on.
Oh yeah. You know me.
All right. So I think that talking about the social media side of things and how people, they post things and they don't really necessarily think about like the broad spectrum impact of what they're saying or what they're advocating for. I think that kind of leads really well into the next question. So this question says, I was listening to your podcast with Will Harris and you made some comments critical of lab grown meat. Please explain your reservations for this innovation. What they're saying is lab grown meat is essentially just using stem cell science, which is already a widely successful field and has massive scientific application.
Okay. So stem cells, yeah, great. Cool. If you look at what stem cells are though, they're sort of these cells that you can harvest, you can put in yourself, they can grow, they can pretty much bifurcate into any sort of cell that your body needs, for example. So let's say you need to grow yourself a new liver or a new whatever. Okay, you can take your own stem cells and then you can just say, okay, grow liver now. This is not the same thing as food. So there's a very huge difference here with stem cell science, which sounds cool and fancy, versus lab grown meat and food. Okay. So what is food? Like what is let's just like think about this from a first principles point of view here. What is food? Like what are we trying to get from food?
Nutrients, calories.
Yes. So we need structural building blocks. Yes. We need calories. We need energy. Yes. We also need nutrients. And the importance of nutrients is that that's how our cells communicate. That's how our body gets stuff done. That's how we fight off other things. It's like basically our body's reserve system besides energy. So we need sort of like these three broad categories: structure, energy, and nutrients. Okay. So when you get lab grown meat, you theoretically can get structure and energy, sometimes energy, yes, not nutrients. Why? These things have to come from somewhere. The lab is not magic. It doesn't, let's put it this way. When we have a scientific ability to be able to make shit out of nothing, we will not have global warming or climate change as a problem. Like this is like someone saying like, oh, well, we'll be able to get everything out of thin air. If that's the case, like, I think eventually we will be able to, and we'll have machines that pull whatever from the air and the atmosphere, and be able to rearrange those molecules and make whatever we want. That will be great for space travel because we'll be able to suck whatever up and just make whatever we want. We don't have that technology yet. So what happens with this lab grown meat, Possible Burger, even like any of these things that claim to be lab grown meat, you still have to get the nutrients from somewhere. So the same thing, like if I don't have nutrients in my soil to grow anything, nothing will grow. I won't have nutrients in any of my food. So what I have to do is get fertilizers. And where do you get fertilizer from? You have to go harvest those nutrients from somewhere. And you have to go dig stuff up. You have to go harvest a bunch of that nutrient, put that into a chemical process, distill all of that, then bring it to this lab, then put that on this lab grown meat, this stem cell. It's not like this stuff just magically accumulates nutrients. The nutrients must come from somewhere. The energy must come from somewhere. Like, it's just like, I wish people would pay attention in physics class, even like in grade school. Like energy doesn't come from nowhere. You need to get it from somewhere else. Nutrients don't come from nowhere. You need to get them from somewhere else. And this whole getting stuff from other places all around the world and harvesting it, I mean, this is the exact opposite of what regenerative agriculture is.
Right.
In that model, you have a self-sustaining system that takes care of itself. There's a closed system theoretically, where you can grow the feed for animals if you need it on the property. Animals eat it. Animals poop and pee all over the place. They burp. This goes up in the atmosphere, comes back down, recycles into the soil. You eat it. You die there. Your bones and your body goes into the soil. The bugs eat your body. That leads to grass. The cows eat it, whatever. This is saying like, okay, we're going to create this giant factory in the middle of nowhere, but we need inputs. So, okay, well, let's get some stem cells. That doesn't just grow out of nowhere with no energetic inputs. You need to put energy into the system. You need to put nutrients into the system. You need to extract energy. You need to extract nutrients from other places that are not at the warehouse or the factory, and then bring them to this thing. So not only is that just a new form of extracting things from the environment to make something else, it is just insane that we can think that we can like outsmart nature in this sense.
Right.
Like we are a complex organism, meaning we have a lot of different things. Like, again, studying complex systems will help people understand this, but you can't predict, just like when COVID hit, when whatever, like we are still at the beginning, like our economy is a complex system. When you have a pandemic hit, we don't know what the hell's going to happen. We still don't know what's going to happen from this fallout. In the human body, if you eat a real food that's humans been eating for a while, like sort of nature takes care of itself. But we're sort of saying in the sense that you're taking a complex system, which is an animal. Like we don't even know what all goes into nutrition at this point. We have no clue. We really don't. And I think people think that we have all this scientists making all these research statements on BuzzFeed and all this shit, but we don't know anything about nutrition, really. So we don't know about the animals we're eating. We don't know about our own body. We're going to change one of those things radically and make it in the lab. make fake meat in a lab and say, yeah, we knew what we were replicating there, and we know how it's going to interact in a human body. There is not one example that I've seen throughout human history where we've tried to mimic what we should be eating, let alone anything in health, but nutrition, that has been good or like as good or better than just eating the real thing.
Mm-hmm.
Which is it's like, if there's never been a case in all of human history where we've man-made something and it's been better for our health ever. Period.
Right. Yeah. Technology and stuff that humans make are pretty good in a lot of other areas. When it comes to health and food production, not so great.
Yeah. And so then you have to ask further questions here. Like, why do we care about lab grown meat?
Yeah. I mean, I think that's the big thing, right? Like, is the why is this conversation exists? And I think that it's because of misinformation and the misconceptions around animal agriculture, right? Like, there's a stigma in animal agriculture that it's bad for the environment, that it's something that we need to get away from, and that the foods produced by it are not good for our health. And I think when we talk about lab grown meat or fake meat, which I do think it's important to differentiate between the two, because there's, fake meat like the Beyond Burger and Impossible Burger that are, based on plant proteins and consist of like monocropped ingredients and things like that. A lot of PUFAs, all of that stuff. Yeah. And then there's lab grown meat, which is essentially something that they're creating that they're actually trying to mimic meat. So those are, two, I think, different things. I think the biggest thing that, is the reason why people think that is because of the misconceptions of the environmental impact of these foods. And that's something that people aren't looking at both sides of the picture. I mean, you talked about energy input, and I think that's really, really important to highlight with this is like, one, we know that greenhouse gas emissions and things like that are vastly overblown when we look at animal agriculture. A lot of times when they're comparing those things, they're not comparing apples to apples. They're comparing, the full life cycle of an animal, everything that it takes to bring it to slaughter or to, put in to get it onto the shelf versus, when they're looking at plant agriculture, for instance, they're only looking at, just the actual greenhouse gas emissions produced from the farming of it. So I think that's a really important thing to know, is that those things are drastically overblown. But then also when we're looking at like energy inputs, it's knowing that you like you said, you have to create this from something. And when we're talking about animal agriculture, we're talking about like, yes, animals give off greenhouse gas emissions, but it's a cycle. It's a cycling of emissions that is going down into the soil. They're eating it. Whereas when we have to create something out of nothing, we have to extract, resources that produces emissions that didn't previously exist, right? So we're introducing new emissions into our atmosphere that didn't previously exist. So the energy input conversation, I think, is critically important for people to think about with this, because you say, why are people asking this question? I think people are asking this question because they either think that these alternatives are healthier or better for the environment. But the truth is, when we look at these things, that's not necessarily the case. And even just looking at, what's the impact of lab grown meat? Well, the impact is that that's going to take away from animal agriculture. And when we're having this full conversation here about regenerative ag and how important that is, and when we talk to a lot of environmental people, they'll tell you that there's not a path forward to, slowing the impact that we're having on our environment and improving the impact of our environment. There's not an alternative to animal agriculture. So if we start going away from these things, we're just further compounding these problems on our environment. So there's such a cost to, increasing our consumption and demand for these fake meats, whether it's, a lab grown meat that's meant to mimic regular meat, or it's a, plant-based fake meat coming from Impossible Burger.
Yeah. There's three main reasons why people are asking this question. You hit on two of them. The first one, environmental, you talked a lot about. It's obvious. Not only are you extracting energy, but you're having to truck things from across the world, if not the country, to this big factory. The energy of like actually doing the synthesis of this stuff that's nutrient poor, and then shipping that back refrigerated, likely to sit in or frozen, like, and then to the end consumer. You know how much energy it takes? Yeah, you know how much energy it takes for me to grow a cow on my farm?
Right.
Zero input. I could just throw a cow in there, and if there's grass, it eats it, and then I can kill it and eat it myself. Like that is zero energy input.
Right.
Two is the health input that we're talking about. Like, so, okay, we can hypothesize what things are in an animal and what amounts, and then try to extract those things and put them into the animal. We don't know how that's going to interact in our body. I think a terrible move. I would never eat this stuff personally.
No.
Somebody else wants to do that, that's fine. But not only that, the health of maybe this sort of goes to the next point, is ethical concerns.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And okay, well, why would we kill all these animals if we could just grow everything in a lab? Well, I just gave you two good reasons for environmental and for the health implications. But it's also like people, I think have such a weird warped view about what death is.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Like we're not going to die. Like no animal is going to die if we don't kill an animal for food. It's like
trying to remove ourselves from that death life cycle.
Yeah, and if you're farming in an appropriate way, you're giving a chance for life. And even if you think cows are conscious, for example, just use that as the animal here, you're giving that animal a chance to experience the world in a short period of time, and then killing it in an ethical way where it doesn't have to suffer at all.
Right.
Versus living in the wild, where many die at birth, they get eaten by coyotes and wolves, they get sick and die. Yeah, get sick and die, just like sit there and suffer. Like, is that the alternative, or is the alternative to eradicate life altogether? So that way there's no life. So that way no life will ever have to end. Like what is the end goal here? For nothing to ever be dead?
Well, I think, and the important side to that too, is that, a lot of the people who are, which I always have a little bit of heart for the ethical conversation, because I think that people who if their primary motive is not eating meat for that reason, I think it's good intentioned. I think these are people who have like good hearts, like they don't want to harm things, but I think that it's ill-informed and like you were saying, the understanding of like death life cycles and how things really work in nature. But then it's also failing to consider what the alternatives are supporting. So when we're looking at fake meat alternatives, I mean, these are made from something. These are made from plants that we know that the farming of these plants lead to far more deaths in terms of field animals. We know that the pesticides and the things that we use to spray these crops that are used in these fake meat alternatives are, killing a ton of insects. We know that those same chemicals are running off into our water supplies and harming the animals that are drinking those water supplies. So it's like, I think it's weird that we get to choose what is okay to kill, right? Like it's not okay to kill a cow, but it is okay to kill, 40
thousands and thousands of different species. Yeah. I mean, it's like the reality of it is that every living thing has to kill something else living to be alive.
Right.
That's just the way it is.
Mm-hmm.
That includes plants. Like plants are sucking things out of the soil and destroying things inside. Like there needs to be dead things in the soil for plants to live, thrive.
Right.
Everything alive needs, like, again, like energy can't be destroyed or created. This is more of a going into a philosophical or spiritual conversation, but like for life to exist, you need life to die. Like this is a cycle of life. You need things to die for you to be alive. And so if you're saying we should never kill an animal or never eat an animal, well, that same rule should apply to plants. Like plants shouldn't kill anything. Then we shouldn't be able to be alive.
Right.
Everything has to eat something else to be alive.
Yeah. And it's
had this transfer of life.
Mm-hmm. And without like this, I mean, you're talking about, how death and the role that it plays in like, soil quality and things like that. I mean, it's like without death, you can't get your avocados that you want to eat. You can't get a lot of those plants that you want to eat. Like all of those things also come with a cost. And I think it's just too reductionist of a view to say, and I've actually had this conversation recently with somebody. I posted something on social media and, there was a comment on it saying that, I just can't justify me getting mine, even if it's more healthy for me or it's better for the environment. I can't justify taking the life of, an animal for me to get my nutrients. And then when you kind of present this other side of it of like, well, the foods that you're eating, you're costing lives too. It's just not directly, there's some sort of justification that comes in there where it's like, well, intent is considered, where we have to consider intent when it comes to death, where it's like, oh, I'm actually killing the cow for food, which is an intentional death. Whereas, I'm eating these soybeans and, I'm not intentionally killing an animal, even though there's a ton dying in the process or a ton being affected. So there's this weird thing where we have to now apply intent behind our actions when it's instead of just looking at, look, when it comes to life, when it comes to death is death, right? Either something is living or it's dying, right? And I think that we can't just we can't separate these things by saying, oh, I didn't intend for those animals to die, therefore these things are okay. Yeah,
I mean, you have to kill something that's living to survive, period. And if you're not killing a cow and you're eating soybeans, you have to kill a soybean plant.
Right.
Like a soybean plant is living.
Right. and it's every bit as living as the cow is.
Right. I mean, like just go walk into a forest. And I mean, this is the thing, like we're so removed from our natural environments, the natural state. The natural state of existence is a continuous observation of life and death.
Right.
Go in the woods and walk around and like look at everything living and look at like a log that falls over. That's a thriving spot for things that are living, especially if like in the Northwest or something like that. Like there's moss growing, there's all these little insects, everything's like eating this dead branch. Like things need things to die to be alive.
Right.
It's like, I don't know. Anybody who disagrees with this, I think needs to get a dose of some of the mushrooms going to be growing at my farm.
Well, no, I think the other thing that we didn't even touch on with that too is that, you know, we talked about it a little bit earlier on, but we don't have a calorie problem, right? And I think like when we're talking about creating fake meat and like lab grown meat, that would make sense if we were having a calorie problem where we weren't able to produce, you know, the foods or the calories needed for our population to sustain itself. But we don't have that problem. We obviously have a nutrient problem, and this doesn't address that. It's just, this is creating more calories, creating more nutrient poor calories, and getting us further away from what we need to be healthy. And I think that like we have to understand all of the impacts that come with that. You know, so far we've talked about the ethical component of it. We talked about the environmental component. We talked about the health component, but also like, what about the economic component to it? Like we have our healthcare costs are ridiculous right now. And, you know, we see, you know, what's the average cost of somebody who's diabetic? I think the average cost for a single diabetic patient is like $240,000 a year in healthcare costs. And it's like, when you're not eating real meat and you're eating these fake meats, that's further compounding on that. That's leading people to being more unhealthy, and that with a burden on our society that's not just the environmental side, and it's not just your poor health. It's something that we all have to face. So this is like such a big conversation. I think it's why like people like yourself who are getting out there and putting good information out there, interviewing people about it. People like we talk about, you know, Sacred Cow, that organization, and the awesome information they're putting out. Can't recommend that book enough. I think it's just having an understanding that like, this is not as simple as what it seems. And like every, you know, when you have these conversations with somebody who's anti-meat or anti-animal agriculture, there's always a response. There's always something else that they can turn to, but it's never considering the full picture. And I think when we consider the picture as a whole, it's pretty clear that there's like one clear path forward for humankind, and that's to eat more animals.
Yeah.
And do it the right way.
You kind of brought up another, I think, a fourth point that we didn't address about why people would ask this thing about lab-grown meat, and it's to feed the world something that's scalable. And I don't think that forcing populations who are struggling with food production currently to be dependent on centralized, massive corporations that have to ship their food around the world is the way to go about feeding the world.
Right.
Like it's about getting them self-sufficient and being able to grow their own nutrient-dense food locally. That's, if a pandemic hits, they're not going to all starve to death because the global supply chain is fragile.
Right. Well, that's actually, yeah. I mean, that's a really good point that was brought up. I think there was a story, I believe it was in Sacred Cow, where they talk about, and I don't remember where it was, but there was like this church in Atlanta, Georgia, who sent like massive amounts of eggs over to this other underdeveloped country. And their intent was good, right? They were trying to provide these people with, you know, food, and they were trying to provide them with good, you know, healthy food, quality calories. But what they failed to consider there was that there was a small local farmer in that area who was trying to produce eggs for that economy, that local economy, that got put out of business because of that. And then a year and a half later, when this church decided to stop donating eggs, this area no longer had that food production available to them. And that's just a smaller example of what's happening on the larger scale. I mean, if you're going out and you're buying Impossible Burger, which is supporting these major corporations, then you're not supporting the guy, you know, the farmer who's doing the local meat and the local produce is now going out of business because of that, rather than you investing that back into that low. And then when shit hits the fan, like we're seeing now with COVID and supply chains run dry, now those people are no longer there to save the day.
And not only that, like I was saying before, there's no education in the space right now. Mm-hmm. And so no one that I know, not one person that I know in Austin, and this, I know farmers because I, do the podcast and know people, like not one of my friends in Austin knows how to grow any food.
Right.
And I can't find resources that I can trust that tells me how to do that.
Mm-hmm.
Like if you start putting all these people out of business, there's no educational resources. People aren't getting into it. Who the hell is going to grow our food?
Right.
Giant factories? corporations. Like we want those people to be incentivized growing our food.
Yeah.
I think it's like turned into a crazy rant this episode, which is good. But I think we should just close it off by saying, with all this stuff, I've mentioned this quite a lot in the past couple of months. Is how I'm trying to distill out of my advice around health, mental health, just life in general. It's like eat local, live local, like support local communities, eat local food. And so many things in this country will be fixed. So many things in the world will be fixed. Your health will be fixed. It just solves every problem. Yeah,
it does. I mean, and even like, there's a question on here. We have one about conventional, like grass-fed versus grain-fed meats. Like even in that situation, if you're even say a local farmer that you're supporting who's maybe finishing his cattle on grain or finishing it on barley or something like that, which I would be curious to get your thoughts on that conversation. But even that still has so many benefits to it, and the quality of the meat that you're getting and what you're supporting. So, it's like people who want to get so, niched and down to the point of like, does it need to be grass-fed and finished? Does it need to be this? Does it need to be that? I think that your answer there of like, if you're just supporting local and eating local, you're moving the needle. That's going to move the needle the most. All the other stuff is maybe the extra 1 or 2%. But what's going to move the needle the most is just sticking to that simple principle, which is supporting local farmers and eating locally whenever possible.
Yeah, I mean, the question I'd have in that sense is the barley grown locally?
Yeah, it's a great question.
Yeah, and like, are the inputs that the cow's eating conventionally, is that grown locally? And if it is, like, is it as big of a deal? And like, you just, conventional beef, generally speaking, is not local. Like,
right. Well, because it's usually
all the things.
Yeah,
but like even if you go to one, like let's say in Iowa, they're growing all the stuff locally and shipping there, like, okay, now you have these giant silos, you have all this stuff. Like the farm production itself is inherently non-local because their neighbors couldn't have built the stuff that they're using.
Right.
I know that's like, this is ridiculous because like you can be like, oh, well, a tractor or a truck or internet's not local or whatever. Like the more you apply these principles, the more you can just sort of like see through many of these layers of greenwashing that happen. I was like, okay, well, we're a local farm, but we're feeding everything from like, we're pulling all this grain from like bringing soybeans from South Africa or South America or something like that. It's like, so yeah, eat local, live local, die local.
Love it, man. So is there going to be any die local as opposed to what?
Good question.
Dying on the moon. Yeah. Don't let your body rot anywhere else other than in our soil. We need it.
Please.
Is there going to be any places, so people who are like excited about what you're doing, you mentioned a book, any good resources out there for people who are want to get into this more, and any places where people can follow what you're doing out at the farm?
Yeah, I'm going to start posting some stuff. I'm going to probably create like a separate farm account and newsletter, all this different stuff. But for now, sign up in my newsletter, dranthonygustin.com/thefeed. It's probably where I'll be most active on it.
Cool. Awesome, man.
Thank you, Chris.
Yeah.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Natural State Podcast. Hope you enjoyed it. And if you did, I'd really appreciate you heading over to whatever service you're listening to this podcast on, dropping me a 5-star review and your thoughts on the show. This helps us get discovered by more people and spreading the good gospel of health. And if you want to stay plugged into all of my self-health experiments, recent research and books that I'm reading and my interpretations of those things, products that I'm testing and thoughts on all things related to health, check out my free weekly newsletter called The Feed. You can sign up for that at dranthonygustin.com/thefeed. That's dranthonygustin.com/thefeed. Thanks again for tuning in your support of the Natural State Podcast.